systems nominal.
Hello my fellow mech heads, I am Zero Sum and welcome to World War III, circa 2015. This is Gungriffon. It is a short-lived but very well-regarded series of mech sims that started with this one here you're looking at right here back in 1996 with Gungriffon: The Eurasian Conflict on the Sega Saturn. The sequel came out 2 years later, followed by Gungriffon Blaze in 2000 on the PS2, and finally Gungriffon Allied Strike in 2004 on the original Xbox. The series was created by the late Takeshi Miyagi, if that's that right, the founder of Game Arts, the company that developed all of the Gungriffon games, who sadly passed away from complications from brain surgery in 2011. Also worked on the Lunar, Grandia, and Sylphid series. Guy had some range. Well, the same thing we said for everybody at Game Arts. Now, I must confess that the console side of the mech sim genre is one that I'm not nearly as familiar or experienced with as I am with the PC side of things. I've been an unapologetic mouse and keyboard gamer for most of my life, so I haven't played nearly as many of these as I probably should have given my very particular giant robot obsessions. Not speaking or reading Japanese doesn't help either, of course, because, given how many of these games never got localized, tends to be quite a few of them. And, to make matters worse, the first two games of this series were on a console that didn't really do all that well back in my neck of the woods back in the late 90s, so that didn't exactly help my chances of playing them at the time. But, in spite of all that, this series, especially the Saturn entries, ironically enough, has managed to make it on my list of all-time greats. And today, I want to get into why, so let's start with some background for starters. The Gungriffon games don't really have a story as such, with characters and plot, that kind of thing. It's more like a historical narrative you get to blow stuff up in. It's like if someone took a PBS war documentary and stuffed it in the arcade cabinet. Now, as is often the case, there is actually a lot of background info that can be found in supplemental materials that, of course, were never published outside of Japan. I did find a website that has a very detailed timeline based on those sources, though, gungriffon.jp. Link will be in the description. It's really a well-done site. The CliffsNotes version is that the world was divided into four major power blocks post-Cold War. There's the Pan-European Union, the Asia-Pacific Community, the Organization of African Unity, and the American Freedom Trade Association. Bit of a mouthful. It's the kind of classic multipolar world structure that we've seen in series like Front Mission and the like, and just like in that world, these supranational alliances are, as you can imagine, at each other's throats, starting with smaller conflicts over resources before it escalates into full-scale warfare, in this case between the PU and APC, with each of the game's missions being a major battle during that time period between February and October 2015. The war kind of ground itself out, luckily it didn't go too long. So, looking over this timeline, it feels eerily prescient in a whole bunch of ways. It's a world where post-USSR, the US didn't become a global hegemon, and instead became more isolationist and focused on the Western Hemisphere, the Monroe Doctrine thing, which resulted in other nations rethinking and forming their own alliances, which I think we can agree doesn't sound all that far-fetched these days, now does it? You just take a look at the news and, yeah. Hell, multiple missions in the first game involve the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. How's that for ripped from the headlines? Again, the game came out in 1996. Seriously. Of course, this assumes you're playing the original version of the game. In the English localization, they bumped up the timeline to 2074, which is understandable. You probably didn't expect the mechs to show up in 2015. Changed the name of the AFTA to the United America Countries. Again, that's very front mission of them. This is the first time the US faction gets a name change. But they also swapped around the combatants of World War III. That last one, it obviously matters, because instead of being a member of the APC Japanese Foreign Legion 505th Mobile Anti-Tank Company, which is, summed up as the Gungriffons, so, a bit of a mouthful there. Instead, you're with the UAC Foreign Legion 45th Armored Division, fighting with the PEU against the APC, which A, makes it weird that you're blowing up German tanks in the opening cinematic, and B, makes it a wee bit awkward nowadays when you're helping the Russians in the Ukraine against the Chinese. As far as I can get to from researching, the most likely reason why this happened, at least I would guess, is that in the final missions, the AFTA takes advantage of the PU and APC having exhausted themselves and steamrolls in to take the win of World War III. So you are shooting and killing American soldiers for a bit, along with all the European troops that you've been blowing up this whole time. I can kind of understand why they might have wanted to tweak that a bit. It's complicated. The rest of the games don't have this issue, though. So Gungriffon 2 didn't get a localization, so there's nothing there to worry about. Later on, a fan patch would come in that's how I ended up playing with it. It's more like an expansion of the original, with missions taking place before and during the ones in the Eurasian conflict. Like, you get to play the very first shots fired of World War III taking place in Libya as the APC mounts an attack on PU forces that are running an exercise there. Gungriffon Blaze takes place in the aftermath of World War III, and Allied Strike is more of a soft reboot. The story doesn't really follow quite as much. Ultimately, all this background stuff is just there to give context to the gameplay, but I think that it also reflects something of the time the original game was made in, and that profoundly affected its aesthetic. Remember, the 90s were not peaceful. This was the decade of Operation Desert Storm, multiple African civil wars. You had the first Chechen war with the Russians, and especially the Balkans tearing itself apart the whole decade long. It's the same stuff that inspired Westwood for that first Command & Conquer game. I'm just a feel of that. The Saturn Gungriffon games feel gritty and grounded in a way that many other mech games don't, even to this day, I think, because it doesn't feel very sci-fi. They were making a game about a war taking place in the very near future, and as such, it reflects the nature of war during that time. Much to its benefit, I would say. I think it gives this series, it gives it a certain feel to it that I don't think really can be found elsewhere. And that also certainly applies to the mechs in Gungriffon as well. About time I got to those, right? The AUGs, Armored Walking Gun System, that's the acronym, are some pretty goddamn believable stompy death machines, frankly. They're just in the sweet spot for my particular real robot mecha taste. Like, they're reasonably sized, utilitarian military designs that look like something out of a Ryosuke Takahashi anime, which I think you all know by now is a hell of a compliment coming from me. And I also love that the different nations of this world have their own AUGs designs from their regional manufacturers. Like, the French have the Autruche, which is the big chicken walker one with the twin guns. So the South Africans had the Elephant design. The Americans have a bunch of them, among others the Brutal Crab, multi-legged ones. Different designs for different military doctrines. And the same goes for the second-gen AUGs, namely the poster boy for the whole series, and probably one of the more believable examples of a transforming mecha in gaming, the Type 12 HIMAX. That's High Mobility Armored Combat System. This thing is very much the titular Gungriffon. It's a cross between an armored vehicle and an attack helicopter. Right? It's fast, mobile, and it's fucking deadly. I mean, 120mm autocannon, handheld, of course. Machine gun built into the torso, rocket pods, anti-tank missiles. The thing is goddamn beautiful, and in spite of that, it's not the be-all, end-all. None of the AUGs are. The Gungriffon games are combined arms warfare games at heart. They're tanks, jets, helicopters, obviously. Gungriffon 2 would give you the ability to call in friendly artillery strikes and bring a wingman with you on missions to Watcher 6. In all the games, except Blaze, which is far more arcadey and has regular pickups and stuff like that, you need to rearm at supply choppers or you'll quickly run out of ammo, especially for your explosives. And those can be shot down, so you gotta bear that in mind and keep an eye on them, babysit them a little bit. That kind of realistic take on a mech game really shines in the gameplay itself too. The controls are simple enough to fit on a Saturn controller, which only have like 13 inputs total. I've made the comparison previously to Steel Battalion, back when I did the video on that game, and I'll say it again here. The Gungriffon games are direct ancestors of that one, both in terms of aesthetic and gameplay. What the developers of Game Arts managed to pull off on late 90s tech is it's nothing short of goddamn amazing, frankly. Because, let's face it, the mech sim genre isn't one that usually lends itself to a limited number of inputs. I mean, you look at pretty much any kind of sim game you find on PC, for example, there. You had previous examples with stuff like the SNS version of Mech Warrior that came out in 1993, and what was it called? Iron Soldier for the Atari Jaguar. That was in 1994. But Gungriffon, frankly, it has them beat in how smooth it plays and how well it sells. The feeling of piloting a mech of this kind that's both really stompy and, very much that kind of like real functional utilitarian feel, but also able to zip around the battlefield very quickly and, have that mobility. And doing so in the middle of an active battlefield, things exploding all around you with, different vehicles coming from all directions. Even now, after all these years, and the aesthetic, again, plays into it. The HUD looks like something out of an Apache or other real-world military vehicles. You got all the sound effects happening, the sound of warning alarms blaring whenever enemies start attacking you, and missiles lock on. That kind of like beep, beep, kind of sounds that you whenever you're firing one of those. The kind of staticky radio chatter that you hear throughout. The booms of gunfire and explosion. It all comes together with these very analog controls to do what for the Saturn, what Steel Battalion would do in a much bigger way later on the Xbox. Now, as far as negatives go, because there are a few, I'm not just going to chisel over these games all day. There's the aforementioned lack of story, and also the fact that these games are very short. The first Gungriffon had 8 missions. Second one also, plus 3 survival missions. Blaze had 6, and finally Allied Strike being the longest with 13. These are games that encourage multiple replays to improve your time and high scores. And, oh yeah, did I mention time? Because every mission in every installment has a time limit. That alone will be a big nope for some people, that I know. Aside from that, draw distance could be better. It's Sega Saturn hardware after all. And customization is very limited. You only got that starting with Gungriffon 2. You more of it to the PS2 and Xbox games. The Gungriffon 2, you could really only just have different varieties of autocan and change a few things, but that was about it. Now, that's for the Saturn games. Blaze, the aforementioned Blaze and Allied Strike are their own can of worms, and I must admit that I don't like them as much. Part of that is my own lack of talent with using a controller in first-person games. Point in fact, I actually usually suck at it. I was expecting to enjoy Allied Strike more than Blaze, on the basis that Blaze went for that more arcadey direction, but of the two, I think I like Blaze more. Part of that was that I was able to change the controls to a more original Gungriffon style, which helped me a lot. For some reason, I'm actually pretty good at the Saturn games. Allied Strike is very much locked into the two twin-stick version, and it's the wrong feel for a guy like me. And also, Allied Strike make a bunch of changes that I just can't agree with. The rollers, the speedy mode for the kind of speedy Votoms mode that these mechs have, they're now on a separate cooldown function instead of just being automatic when you hit your max acceleration, which it doesn't have the right feel for me. And I don't like how you automatically have forward momentum when doing the jump. Even when you're holding back on the joystick, you should always be moving forward, which makes it much harder to aim at things when all you want to do is just pop up VTOL style and take out target and just hit back down to the ground where you were. But worst of all, they added a locational damage system that will disable systems on your mech if they get hit too much. So like, you lose the head, you lose your radar. You lose the arms, you lose your main gun. You lose the legs, you can no longer roller dash. Now, I've played plenty of games where that happens. Many of them are among my all-time favorites, and you've seen me play them on the channel, but what they don't do is have it only happen to you. It's one thing if a lucky shot from an enemy takes out my main gun, but if I can't return the favor, then I call bullshit. And yeah, it's some bullshit. I will say, the mechs do look great on PS2 and Xbox. They still got that kind of chunky feel to them that I like. And I especially like Blaze's diorama style model viewer thing that it's got. That's a really nice touch. Then being able to level buildings with high explosives is always a good feature to include. I kind of wish that you could do that in the original Saturn games. So that's it for the Gungriffon series, except not really, because there's actually an unofficial Gungriffon 3 out there, and not only is it a great goddamn game, it's 100% free. Around 2010, some Japanese Gungriffon fans got together and began to make essentially a PC sequel to the Saturn games, releasing High Max Simulator in 2013 with the final update dropping 4 years later. This game is everything Gungriffon 1 and 2 were, but expanded and enhanced. It's Gungriffon on steroids. The game keeps the same lo-fi, gritty military aesthetic, only now with even more precise and smooth gameplay, thanks to mouse and keyboard controls, so, great for me. You got 11 missions, some very familiar if you played the original games, others completely new, plus survival modes, mechs and vehicles you can unlock with their own mechanics, like flying an Apache helicopter, pilot the Brewcrowd, the Jagdpanther. There's support vehicles for resupply and long-range radar as well. Not to mention, you can direct your allies through the satellite view like in an RTS, which adds a whole new layer of strategy onto the proceedings. It's really great. This is exactly the kind of direction I would have loved to see the series move towards. You know, expanding on the existing gameplay and keeping that unique look and feel that helped make Gungriffon so special, even back in '96. About the only downside here is that it's all in Japanese, for obvious reasons. But these days, that can be worked around fairly easily. There's software you can install to do real-time translation on your own screen. And also, there's a fellow YouTuber named Argenbolt who put out a walkthrough series of in-universe training modules. It's really quite fun for the game itself to help us all out, you know, figure everything out. So links to that and the mech simulator stuff will be in the description. Definitely check out both of those out. They're well worth your time. So, what do I see for Gungriffon in the future? Well, obviously not much on the official side. Game Arts has, it seems, retired the franchise and, you know, moved on to other greener pastures. We got mech simulator to fill the void at least, but what I would love to see is that the lessons this series teaches will find people willing and able to apply them in their own games, especially in the indie scene. One of the big ones for me is that sim games don't need to be complicated. Remember, this was 1996 on Sega Saturn, and they managed, with the right look and feel, they made a game that really immerses the player in the driver's seat. Here in this case, it's, you know, obviously a near future mech, but you can do the same with anything like a regular tank game, for instance, would benefit from that too. And also, just because you're making sci-fi doesn't mean it should look very sci-fi, especially if you're creating something that's based in the nearest future version of our own world. It really helps maintain that kind of verisimilitude that way. I expect that footage from the currently ongoing Ukraine and Iran wars are going to have an impact on future military game aesthetics, the same way that the wars of the 90s had on games like Gungriffon, the same way that the GWAT influenced any number of military shooters over the years, for good or ill. I think the Gungriffon series also demonstrates that while you can have, in fact, should probably have deep stories with compelling characters, and those are very good, sometimes just having the player be a small, anonymous part of the whole, swept along by much larger world events, is all the narrative you really need. It's the whole Dark Souls thing where you're basically creating the narrative through pieces of information, you know, dribbled out to the player. Only in this case, it's through briefings, through updates on world events and things like that. You're creating a historical narrative rather than a personal one, and that can work just as well. And finally, you don't need state-of-the-art bleeding-edge graphics when you've got style. Because, I'll tell you, even now, decades later, after the first one of these games came out, I can still be watching these low-poly mechs go up in pixelated explosions, and it never gets old. So, bear all this stuff in mind. I have been Zero Sum. This has been my ramblings about Gungriffon. And until next time, I'm ejecting. Bye-bye.
All primary objectives complete. Mission successful.